So my name is Satyen Sangani, and I'll just do a very brief introduction about who I am and what Alation is, and I'll talk about something that's, you guys are going to be guinea pigs because I've never done this talk before. So it's either going to be horrible and I'll be run out of the room or something better than that. So Alation is broadly what one could describe as a data catalog. A data catalog is basically something that crawls internal data sources and BI tools and broadly generates a reproduced history of all of the sort of analytics that have been produced and all the data assets that have been produced in an organization. It's a company that I am one of the founders of and the CEO of. We founded the company about 5 years ago, based in Silicon Valley. And it's based upon that vantage point that I'm sort of doing this talk, which I think is going to start with a little bit of a bang. So we all have heard about alternative facts. Well, does everybody know this story? Only one person knows this story. Okay. Data-driven, but not news-driven, apparently. All right, so we've got this gentleman who everybody knows, and he comes out and he says, this is the hugest inauguration ever. Now, forget about the partisanship in this. We'll just go through the facts of the story. And the largest inauguration ever looks like this, and it apparently was something that needed to be defended because other people said, hey, no, that's not exactly the largest inauguration ever. This is the largest inauguration ever, and it had more people. And the experts came out and said this had 1.8 million people. And then this gentleman got up and defended the president and said, hey, this is actually a correct statement that in fact, this was the largest inauguration ever, but for certain conditions. And so let's actually go through the actual narrative. So the first claim was largest inauguration ever. All right, so the first fact, the alternative fact, was that it was 1.5 million people, and experts say that it was about 300 to 600,000 people. Okay, then the most ever is another fact, right? Because now you're going to have to compare what was originally stated as the largest inauguration ever, which was to the president's statement, 1 to 1.5 million people, to the largest one ever. And it turns out the largest one ever was 1.8 million people. And if you look at the query, that just goes across all inaugurations, right? Now, you get to the world of alternative facts, and it turns out that when you control for rain and you control for security, which is what Sean Spicer said that one needed to do to assess the largest inauguration ever, in fact, you get to 360,000 people, and that's how you get to an alternative fact, right? You control the data, and you build a narrative in a way that supports the claim that you want to make. Now, my contention to you in this audience is that the investment in data analytics that every single person in this room is making for the companies that you are making is building as much noise as signal. And it's building as much complexity as it is understanding. Maybe a little bit more understanding, right? But a lot of complexity. And in that world, you don't necessarily know for all of the tens of thousands of people that every single day just in New York City happen to be creating analytics, what their intent is, what their context was, where the data came from, the assumptions that they made, how they made those analytics up. And as a consequence, you have an alternative facts problem that exists inside of the enterprise with as much fake news, with as much lack of understanding as you do in the public domain. That's a pretty extreme statement. But let me kind of unwind the history to give you sort of a perspective on why I think that might be true. So, old day and age, traditional media, you had the New York Times, they were trusted, you have Bloomberg, God bless Bloomberg. You've got, the news networks. People use typewriters and Microsoft Word and really old movie cameras. And you could store things inside of basically video cassettes, or you can go to bookstores, or you can go to libraries. And you'd have librarians who would be trusted, and they'd study library sciences, and they'd find you things. And the stuff and the facts in the world were generally consistent, but it would be really hard to go to Barnes & Noble because you'd have to travel, or you'd go to the library, you'd have to travel. And if you wanted to get some historical media, you'd have to go find that media, and you'd go to the microfiche room, and if you remember that, you'd have to leaf through things, right? Now, in the new world, it turns out that there are more sources of facts. You have all of this existing, but you've got things like TMZ and Breitbart Media, and on the left, Huffington Post, and you've got iPhones creating videos, and you've got people tweeting things all day long. You've got, including people in this audience apparently, and you've got the World Wide Web where things are stored and very accessible. And there is not a lot of curation. These people were relatively trusted. These people, who knows? And there's a lot of different truth, and there's a lot of speed, and you can go to unlimited depth when you're digging around, right? So really fast to get information, but the provenance and the quality of that information is not known. And so the problem is we've got too many information sources. The errors and the bad actors are discernible from the good actors. There's a lot of complexity, and your motive breeds confirmation bias. You look for the information that supports the claim that you want to make, because parsing through all the information is just too much of a pain. And so facts are basically hard to find, hard to understand, hard to trust. Now let's go to the enterprise. So the enterprise, we started off, and now we're kind of moving to the other direction. This is all the complexity that Pratt talked about. You've got tons of different technologies on-premise in the BI stack where you consume things. You've got data preparation tools, not typewriters and video cameras, but things like Informatica and Ab initio and actual code, which people type away at. You've got storage systems. And all of this stuff was broadly built to create a single source of truth. There was one place that people could go, and information was broadly consistent. It was sold to the CIO, sometimes to the CFO, and the information was relatively slow to get. To stand up a business objects universe and cube and a Teradata warehouse or a Netezza warehouse or whatever warehouse could take anything on the order of 2 years, right? And then along comes the world of self-service, right? And people would get data, and in this world, you have Tableau, which sits on a desktop. And every single person that wants to build a report can build a report, just like they might be able to do in Excel. And in this world, I can tell whatever truth I want to be able to tell because all the facts are there for me to prepare. And I can do really complicated ETL and data preparation. I can do it with arbitrary scale on the cloud using things like Kazina. And I can author reports in any way, and there is no curation. The curation is done by me, the fact creator, right? And so there are multiple truths. It's really fast to get things, and the speed at which I can get this stuff and the depth to which I go is relatively unlimited. And guess what, people? The problem is exactly the same. There's a lot of tools creating a lot of different data. The code is super complicated and hard to parse. And there's too much data in too many systems. And that means if I'm a creator of data, what do? I probably go find data that supports the claims that I might want to make, right? And I bet you everybody here does that to a greater or lesser extent every single day, maybe every single week, maybe every single year, but it's certainly done. And if you would believe that's not the case, let's go through a couple of simple examples that might help with this. So this is a trend, right? This is taking data from April to October, right? You can tell a story, and it seems like whatever this thing is measuring is going down, broadly speaking. But if you segment it to just August to October, you could tell a totally different trend, right? And so how many analyses have we done where we want to show a trend or show a report or show a claim, and we select to a certain set of data in order to be able to make a claim that supports the point of view that happens to be coming from our perspective. Another alternative is to choose the calculation that sort of fits your potential needs. So how many people have calculated churn rate ever? Anyone? Okay, a couple of people in the audience, right? So churn rate could be based upon a couple of different things. So if your revenues are growing, you could say, hey, churned revenues, the amount of revenues you lost, divided by total revenues equals a certain number. Okay? That number is going to be relatively low. Or maybe it's high if you're a bad service, but whatever. Then you could have another measure that says churn revenues are the average revenue over the period. Now again, if your revenues are growing, then the average revenues are going to be lower than the high point. And in this circumstance, you're going to get a slightly lower number on churn. You can do a third measure which says churned revenues are the beginning of period revenues, and you're going to get something that's down here, and so now my churn rate's going to be even higher than the third statistic. Again, I can tell any story that I want to tell. Which one am I going to use, right? But all I have to do is call this churn. I don't have to describe what's inside of all of this stuff unless somebody asks. And then there's a fourth one, which is churned revenues are the revenues over the things that were up for renewal. Now, in theory, that's the most accurate claim. That's the most accurate metric, because if something wasn't up for renewal, then you can't really say that it was churned, right? And so people can pick the metrics. And so this is what people do inside of enterprises. This is what we do often when we're trying to prepare a report and tell a story, because effectively analytics are the process of explaining things. And we're trying to tell stories, and we're trying to explain things, right? Another example is just something very simple. We talk to companies all the time. We have X number of customers. Well, that could be parties paying us money, parties using our product, parties that we have legal agreement with. Those are all very different things. And how we measure things and how we choose to tell the story, again, very different. Those are sort of what I will call intentional decisions made by people who have a lot of understanding about what they happen to be doing, or maybe in some cases less understanding. But in a world of complexity, Pratt made many references to how there could be complications in analytics and places where things fall apart. You could also just make mistakes, right? If you're a report preparer, you could just make a mistake. And so you could create an alternative fact based upon just creating an error. So in this case, Russia and Turkey happen to be counted inside of Europe, but they're also counted inside of Asia. Now, somebody could have done that inadvertently. They could have done that just by cutting and pasting, but they could have done that, right? And so here's another example where the creation of the analytic allows me to create another alternative fact, in this case inadvertently. Or I might be trying to join two different tables, the exchange rate table with the customer ID table, and I do it on a join condition, but I don't cover the as of date, so I take currencies that are invalid, right? Another way that I can create an alternative fact. And then this is my favorite example. You can always just try to game the results. So this is an app that some people, I've never used this app, but it's an app that some people have used. It's called Tinder. No, really, I'm married, so like really. So in this case, you matched. And interestingly enough, what happens right after you've matched is you get this screen. How would you rate the app? Well, you've met her or him, so maybe you rate it favorably because you've been successful. And then once you've given this rating up, you go to the App Store and give your rating, because they know that if you give it a 1, it's pretty unlikely that you would want to go there, so they're not going to refer that screen to you, right? Now, this isn't just, so this is somebody who's created, and now the person at the company can make the claim, we have a 5-star app, right? That's the claim that can be made. Now, the reality is in making that claim, the person who is developing this application, who's developing this algorithm to give this sequence of events, was probably just doing what they were told. And actually, there's tons of blogs out there that say, if you're an app developer, make sure you time when you're getting the rating from the App Store at a really good, happy, high engagement point in your app, because that's when you're most likely to get a high rating, right? But this is an alternative fact, and if you had no other context, all you would know is if you're inside the company, outside of the company, a VC reviewing the company, that this is a very, very strong app that everybody seems to happen to love, right? But you wouldn't know how the data was created. You wouldn't know the fact that you're sample selecting this entire population to be in this set. So I think the point of this presentation for me, and the thing that I'd impart all of you with is just the core idea to think of, is kind of like food labeling. We've got to kind of figure out analytical labeling, right? That it's not good enough for us to kind of accept information that's proffered to us without understanding how that information was produced, where that information came from, who produced it, and the context around which it was done. And so, when I think about kind of, moving forward and moving in a world where we're building sort of fact patterns and understanding, part of the scientific method is to be able to communally test and understand our assertions and methods. So make sure that when you're looking at data, understand the context. And if you're going to publish data, publish the context. When you're looking at data, make sure that your information is relatively easy to reproduce and that you can take your methods and results and package them up, right? Good data scientists do this. And if you've got workbooks, those are really good examples of how this could be done. And empower trust by publishing methods with your facts. So when you push it to somebody who perhaps is less clear about what you've done, make sure to push that information. And so the shameless plug that I'll end with is, with something like a data catalog, we unmine all of those assumptions. We discover them, we understand them, we do that mechanically, we do that automatically. And that way we can get to things like lineage and understanding and relationships and what's going on inside of those different tools that people use in order to understand this stuff. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's a great talk for the maiden voyage of the talk. I think that was a complete success. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell us more about the company and then the product in some detail. So the data cataloging, what does that, you mentioned what that means, but in the reality of the experience of a user, what do they use it for? Who are they?
Yeah, so it's inspired by things like Stack Overflow and Amazon and Wikipedia. The basic idea is that as all of these facts and analytics and reports and data sets are getting created, there's a lot of knowledge that's built in the creation process, but most of that's opaque to other people. And so what we did with Alation is we sort of said, why don't we build something that crawls enterprise data sets and analytics tools like Google crawls the web and looks at the logs for how people have manipulated the data, the queries that they've written, the reports that they've created, and uses that to give people a sort of Amazon-like experience. And so you get people who looked at this data also looked at this data. People who queried this table also queried this table. People who wrote this report also happen to look at that report. And so it gives you kind of that shopping experience around your data so that you can understand what you're looking at and get sort of that easy discoverability, easy searchability, so that people can be a little bit more data literate. So that's the thesis. And we mostly sell to larger enterprises, companies like GE and Pfizer and others.
So part of it is governance and control, and part of it is recommendation, use, leverage more of your internal data to do great things? That's
exactly right. So I think when one thinks about governance, generally one thinks about documenting a whole set of policies or telling people what they can and can't do. And most people don't react well to sort of that behavior modification and often just ignore what's documented. And so when you think about Alation, what we do is we say we observe the behavior, we give people information, and then on top of that you can give suggestions to people, some of which may come from a governance orientation or a suggestion orientation around where you might get the right data sets.
Okay, great. And last question from me. Do you like data lakes? Does that make your work easier, better, or is that a waste of time since you can crawl everything wherever it is?
I mean, I think that data lakes are a very efficient way to store data, and therefore really practical for a company that has a lot of data to store. A file system isn't a very good way to organize information. So if you're a consumer of that information, why the file got there, how it got there, how I can pull fish out of the lake is the sort of overwrought analogy, is a really difficult thing to do. And so Alation is particularly useful in that context because we can sit on top of a lake and tell you what's inside of it, what people have done with the data inside of it.
Great.
Hi, would you say that in addition to other things, are you acting as a kind of a Git for data? Is that?
Yeah, that's an analogy that people have used.
Okay, and then so on that, could you comment on something like Pachyderm and how you might kind of compare and contrast? Because a little bit of backstory. I worked with a lot of geospatial data at my last company, and the provenance and versioning of data is incredibly important. So you have to roll back to get this particular version, similar to how you would with code. So it takes on very different dimensions when you're dealing with spatial data in particular. So I'm curious if somebody who's thought a lot more about this notion of archiving data in this way.
Yeah, I mean, so we focus really on what is effectively the human interaction pattern with data. And so the unpacking can occur through what could be, for example, a lineage-oriented process where you look at what people have written to the table, what people have edited the table with, so update statements, create statements, and the like, to sort of effectively get at what are all the changes that have been made. Now, we don't do sort of a full version and rollback inside of our product. If you want to do something with that level of sophistication, there are other products that you could use. But the idea is, again, to your point around reproducibility. And where we really work is in the context of sort of business analysts and data scientists who are trying to figure out what was done, not necessarily recreate something as was 2 years ago in a context of what did the world look like at that point in time. But that's a valid use case, just a slightly different run from what we currently handle.
And I also had a question similar. I was thinking about what are your thoughts on using like blockchain technologies for these kind of things, like thinking about every change that every person makes to a code as kind of a transaction and giving it to another person and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting. I mean, I think that I think particularly in industries where you can, where there is a code and an encoding method so that you can tie for example, the blockchain to an understandable language where people can make manipulations, like marrying those two ideas where the manipulative language as well as the encoding are sort of married could be very exciting, because now you could sort of have a set of tools or many tools speak the same languages and how data could be manipulated, and that could be a very exciting thing. I think we're far away from that because most of the tools have very different ways of manipulating data and very different ways of speaking to data. So right now, SQL is the best that one can do, and so that's what we do today. But I think in the future, as you get to use cases around security and currency manipulation and preparing analytics that might be, very sophisticated, that could be very interesting.
Hi, as someone who works in analytics, right here.
Got it.
Wanted to ask, do you also help your clients define the metrics or define the business problem? A business problem for analytics could be measuring risk for risk, or say marketing metrics for a marketing or a sales analytics team. Is that also your forte, or is it only solving or giving the answers? Because I think the bigger problem is defining what you want to measure or the measurement metrics.
Yeah, and well, so I think it's an interesting question. So analytics is an iterative process. Like often, I think I have a question, and I go to an analyst and I ask the question, and the person says, "Well, I don't have that data, and so let me unwind and give you what I could tell you," and then they iterate back and forth, right? So I think what Alation does is it captures what's available and what questions have been asked in the same place. So just like you go to Google and use it as a starting point, you can create that interaction and interrogation and iterativity, whatever you call it, in a continuous way. So I think we assist that process, but we're not a consultancy that sort of says, hey, you're thinking X, we're going to tell you how to answer that question. We just help you as you interrogate, think through what are the assets you need and what are the questions that people have asked before you.
Wait, last question here.
Yeah, a question and a comment. First, a comment. So I'm glad you brought up this whole issue about truth and fake news and all this stuff. So I just want to provide a geopolitical, historical context for this. Okay, so if you look at US, one of the mottos is, in God we trust. Comparable motto for India, Satyameva Jayate, truth always prevails. Okay, and if you look at Indian literature, philosophy, Mahabharata, one of the religious texts, the gods are lying left and right. Okay, so the whole point is, yeah, truth is important, but to fast forward a few thousand years, we are in a situation now where we are struggling to determine what is true and what is not. Okay, so now who are the arbiters of truth? What do I tell my children? Where should they go to find the truth? What source can they trust? Do we have answers? That's my question to you.
Yeah, well. It's softball, yeah.
And you have 30 seconds.
So I think science is a religion of sorts. There's a great talk from those of you who want to watch. It's by a Harvard professor named Naomi Oreskes, and she talks about why believe in science. And so my only answer to this question is that what she basically describes is a world where facts are discovered, people sort of make insights, and then through sort of a scientific interrogation process, we continuously discover what we know by people testing and asserting and challenging that which has come before, right? And so I don't think that truth is an ever-evolving thing. At least you're always discovering new things. We know what gravity is, but why it exists and how it exists, we have no idea. One day we might, but then why those things exist, who knows, right? So this interrogation process, I think, is eventual and constant. But, I think we just have to be curious, and we just have to be constantly rational. We have to be skeptical, and, we try and do what we will.
Great answer. Thank you very much.